Hey folks, here's another video about the open book quiz we're going to be doing. I've struggled a little bit to figure out the best way of doing this, that it's just a little awkward to do online. But what I've done is I've simplified things, A, for the quiz, and B, I have also pushed things back, so the actual quiz is not going to be due until um, the very end of the semester, till the 20th of May. But what I'm doing today is giving you the review information and explaining you uh, what the quiz is, and we'll go from there. So we're going to review the concepts. You're going to be sent the quiz as a Word doc, and then you can either write your answers in the doc, save it and send it back, or you can print it out, handwrite your answers, and scan and photograph your pages and send them to me. It'll just be a couple of pages of writing. And on the quiz, you'll be asked to do a few different things to just demonstrate your understanding of the most important concepts from the semester. And of course, any problems you have with the logistics of any of this, just let me know. I will work with you, help figure it out. It will all be fine. The first part of the quiz is going to be the document I send you will have several color samples. I'm going to be asked to describe them in terms of the three attributes of color: hue, intensity, and value, and say whether the samples are tints, tones, or shades. We'll review all that in a second. And then number two, we're going to give you four different images, and you're going to make comments of those about those images, demonstrating understanding of the following concepts. So, for example, there'll be a concept listed like diagonal composition, and a couple of lines to write after that. And you'll look at the images I give you and identify one where you see that concept in action, write a sentence or two explaining how you see that in action, and boom, that's what you're gonna need to do for each concept listed. We have a variety of things here. We've got the attributes up top, all of these concepts down here, which are a mix of design things and color things. So let's go over each of those in turn, using some images as a reference. Okay, so let me just reorganize things here. And get things. 1 second. Okay. All right. So the three attributes of color is going to be the first thing, right? So here we have the attributes laid out. We have, on the left, we have a given color sample has a particular hue, right? So remember, we imagine this as we select a color sample, then we describe it in terms of these three attributes. So a given color sample might have a hue of yellow. It might have an intensity, that is how pure or impure the color is, of high, medium, or low. You can see here examples of high intensity colors that are very pure, similar to the pure colors on the hue wheel. And then as we go down to medium and low, we have the more dull versions of those colors, lowered in intensity. We remember that the lowest intensity colors are the grayscale, right? Any black, white, or gray, those are all as low in intensity as you can possibly go. And then we have over here for value, we have light, medium, and dark values, which are basically in a black and white picture, how light or dark would that color appear? And we remember that the colors are can be high intensity and be light, and be high intensity and be dark. Intensity and value are separate issues, right? So we really want to keep them distinct on our minds. And part of what we do is we remember to say, for values that are light, we say light. For values that are dark, we say dark. We don't use the high-low language of intensity in order to keep those categories separate. So this is the system by which we can describe any color sample in a very specific way by describing what its hue is, what its intensity is, and what its value is. And in words here, we have the definitions listed. Hue is the color on the hue wheel that a color sample most resembles. Intensity is the strength of the hue visible in a color sample. And value is the lightness or darkness of a color sample. So that is the three attributes. And if you need to review it again, pause, listen again. Hopefully it'll make sense. So the second thing tacked on to the attributes of color, which is related but separate, is the idea of shade, tone, and tint, right? So say you've got a given color sample. That is, say you've got a high intensity version of a color, like this blue-green kind of color, pretty high intensity on the left. When you think about lowering its intensity, you can go in three major directions. You can move it toward black, you can move it toward gray, you can move it toward white. So the word for moving it toward black is shade. The word for lowering its intensity but not lightening or darkening at all is called toning it, right? Just sucking the hue juice out of it until it gets toward gray. And then tinting is moving that color toward white, basically making what we often call pastel colors, but a whitened version of a hue. These are related ideas to the attributes, but they're a little different in a subtle way. Okay, so those are the major color ideas that are the foundations of things. So let's move on to the next topics down the way here, which are, first of which is composition, right? So we remember that composition is basically the overall kind of skeletal structure of an image, right? How are the elements organized in the broadest terms in a picture? And we have here some examples of different types of organizational schemes you could have in a very schematic kind of diagrammy kind of a way. Spiral, all over, diagonal, zigzag, symmetrical, asymmetrical, grid-based, pyramidal, and we could go on, and there could be many further refinements to these and compositions which can't neatly be put in any of these categories, but these give a general sense of the types of things that types of ways we could organize a picture. So that is composition. It's on. We handed out the sheet earlier in the semester. Hopefully you've got it. This kind of gives a menu of all different design ideas. Okay. Right off the bat, we talked a bunch about form type. Now it says here on the sheet organic shape and geometric shape, but you can also think of geometric as polygonal, right? Straight-edged shapes. We worked a lot with that. Sometimes it's also called organic. Also called polygonal or geometric. Simple as it sounds, just shapes that have a geometric perfection versus more organic, curvy sorts of forms. Next up, we have positive-negative ambiguity, which, of course, we did a bunch with, right? Here we have the Batman. It's in black and white here, but we have the idea that when we are working with pictures, the whole idea of what's the background and what's the stuff is not absolute, right? Because it's all about how we construct things, and you can construct things so that the negative space can have a positive quality too. So when we flip this over, we get this positive shape in the empty space. We're creating a flip-flop, an ambiguity between what is negative and what is positive in the picture. And we have another image here to kind of give an overview of positive-negative ambiguity at work, right? Various versions of this idea where there's a flip-flop between which of the zones counts as empty and which of the zones counts as full, and the various flip-flopping between those two. That's positive-negative ambiguity. So those are some of the major design concepts that I want us to go. We've covered other things. Of course, we've covered, oh, sorry, there's one other to say from our design sheet here, which will perhaps be on the quizzes. Just the general idea of hierarchy and focal point, right? That in images, generally there is differing almost a differing importance of various elements, right? And one way you can think about this is as hierarchy, is like there's a major thing and then there's a secondary thing. And I think this is a very closely related idea to the idea of focal point. Having spots in your image that draw the eye for one reason or another. We could think back to our collages from the beginning of the semester where we had hot spots in a picture that stood out because their hue was in contrast to everything else in the picture. All right. So there's obviously other stuff we did with design. We talked about scale, contrast, other things, pattern, but that's all that's going to be on the quiz, just the design concepts that appear on that sheet. The midterm, the final review sheet, quiz review sheet. Okay, so that's design ways, but then there are also some other color things to cover that will be asked about. One is if we zoom in on our hue wheel here and we start to analyze it more specifically, the various hue relationships. We have the idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary hue, right? We have what we refer to as our painter's primaries, our red, yellow, and blue primaries, and then the midpoints between those as being orange, violet, and green, and the midpoints among those being red-orange, red-violet, blue-violet, etc. So that we tend to divide our hue wheel into these 12 steps going around the wheel here. This is the system based upon the painter's primaries. We've said in the past that this is not the absolute system, that there are other systems of color, of primary colors that work differently and have different uses. And I will link at the end of the semester to some info about some of that, but I don't want to confuse things by getting into it right now. But these primary, secondary, and tertiary relationships are what we tend to think of as most important when painting, especially. These are especially relevant for painting. And of course, we know that you could further divide this much more, that this is actually, the transitions between these colors are actually smooth, and but the 12 steps tends to give enough specificity for most cases. Okay. Next up, we have our sort of three major categories of relationships amongst colors in the hue wheel, amongst the hues. We have the idea of complementary hues, which are directly across the hue wheel, right? Like orange and blue, direct complements, or red and green, or yellow and violet. Those are complementary pairs. We have the more general idea of contrasting hues, so hues that may or may not be complementary, but just hues that are far away from each other on the hue wheel tend to have that a certain kind of strong relationship with each other. Complementary hues are always contrasting hues. Complementary hues are a special subset of contrasting hues. And then, as opposed to those kinds of relationships, we have analogous hue relationships, which are the relationships between colors that are neighbors on the hue wheel, so next to each other, closely related on the hue wheel. The other idea that we want to make sure we understand is color proportion, right? Which is the idea of when you're making a design, it's not just which colors you use, but how much in relation to one another. So we've got here a little thing with a nice final project piece, and then a sort of inventory, approximate inventory, not perfect, but of the various major colors in the piece, with the different bands trying to represent how much of those different colors are there. So that just to demonstrate that idea that you can have a design that you could have a very different design with the same colors depending on how you balance out your hues in your piece. And then finally, get your eyes steeled for the equal value contrasting hue electric effect. So remember, we talked about this some when we were working on our positive negative ambiguity pieces. The idea that when you have colors that are equal in value but contrasting in hue, your brain has its disagreement with itself, right? Where it wants to say that the green and the red are One part of your brain is saying that they are very different because they're different hues. One is green and one is red. But another part of your brain is saying, no, they're the same because neither color is really much lighter or darker than the other. In a black and white picture, they wouldn't be contrasting. They would be very, very similar to each other. And that disagreement between the strong difference of hue versus the sameness of value gives this buzzing, electric, eye-popping kind of effect. That can indeed be painful if you look at it too long, but it's interesting because it's an example of this idea that value is just a separate question from hue. So look at that, digest that, so you make sure you understand that concept of the equal value contrasting hue. All right, so that is the basic concepts to be reviewed. As I said, I've kind of simplified things to make it more easy. So I will send you the actual quiz for you to complete that will include the color samples to describe in terms of hue, intensity, and value, and say whether they're tint, tones, and shades, as well as 4 images, and then a big list of concepts to make observations about the various images in ways that show you understand each of these concepts in turn. Okay.